Joining us, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author of the briefing book on Substack, Joel Rubin, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now contributor Peter Baker, and staff writer at The Atlantic, Tom Nichols. All right, so Peter, there was just a White House press briefing. How did Karoline Leavitt defend the president's decision-making today?
Well, look, every time the president says something that seems completely contradictory, it's Karoline Leavitt's job to go out there and pretend that it's somehow consistent. And this is the trick for this war, right? He says one thing, as you rightly point out, 1 minute, and another thing, another. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about unconditional surrender. Now we're talking about negotiations, which are, of course, conditional. And it's in some ways, it's the uncertainty, which they say is intentional, may have some strategic purpose. Nobody can be 100% sure what Donald Trump might do next. That's, there's an advantage to that in some way. But it also means that, even he doesn't seem to know what he's doing or what he's going to do next. And because it seems to be so conditioned on the impulse of the moment, the thing he happens to see on TV, the thing somebody happens to tell him most recently. And I think that that's the kind of thing that is, really concerned both the allies and a lot of American officials who are not certain where this war is going.
So, David, should we even be asking about what the president is saying and what he means, or should we, in fact, be looking at the actions of this administration and the Pentagon, what they're doing with troops, how they're positioning armature and firmament?
We should be looking at what he does, but that statement that you read from, he threatened to destroy all of Iran's energy plants. That's a war crime. You can target energy plants. We've talked about this before, but you can't target every energy plant in the country, the ones that serve civilians. And then there was another line also where they were going to target water plants, basically saltwater plants that turn salt water into drinking water. That in this region is an incredibly dangerous escalation because every major country in this region needs those plants. So Iran hit one plant in a Gulf state earlier in this war, and the fear was that this would start this tit for tat. You would have Tehran evacuated, Abu Dhabi evacuated, Dubai, Riyadh. Like, if you start getting into that level, no drinking water for anyone in the region, that too is a war crime. So and what Peter said, so this is the unpredictable president, and he says crazy things. Is that wearing well with American voters? We'll see in November. Is it causing the Iranians to back off and give up? Not at all. They're holding the line. I've heard the latest thing is there's still talks. They're focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but there's no agreement. The Iranians want some kind of joint control thing. They want payments from SHIP, like sort of reparations. But Trump keeps saying they're begging for a deal, and there's no evidence.
There's also talk that they've only been able to destroy a third of Iran's missile capacity.
Yes, I confirmed that with a U.S. official who followed that closely. And it's only one third of its missile capacity. And most importantly, according to the U.S. official I spoke to, only one third of their drones. So those long-range Shahed drones that have been a particular problem, maybe another third are buried, but it's still many thousands of drones remain in their arsenal.
So, Tom, isn't that just proving the limits of an air operation? That if they really want to destroy this all, potentially do regime change, stop the regime from ever having a nuclear bomb, get the uranium, this will be a ground invasion.
Well, it's also proving the limits of Donald Trump's ability to think ahead, that we're not going to get regime change from the air. That is just something that I'm sure the president was warned about on day one. He still seems to believe that just pummeling Iran and, bouncing the rubble is going to lead to a new regime. I think a month in, it's pretty clear that's not going to happen. And so now, as David just pointed out, he's threatening war crimes. And that's not going to move the Iranians. I mean, in a way, the Iranians are probably saying, if that's, your position, have at it, because that doesn't, that's not really a negotiating tactic, threatening to kill civilians at this point. So, yeah, the whole thing is an exercise in showing the limits of certain kind of operations that can be very successful on their own terms, in terms of hitting the targets, destroying them, bringing the pilots back home safely, but the inability kind of piece those together into some strategic direction. And I think we have to keep going back to this over and over again. He didn't know what he was getting into. He thought this was going to be over quickly and that he would become the liberator of Tehran. And now that that hasn't happened, he and his team, frankly, simply don't know what to do at this point.
Presumably, though, there are people within the government that knew about all of these contingencies. I mean, Joel, bring me into a briefing room, what a typical briefing room would be, where you talk about what you could and could not do in Iran, or if you want X, how you get to X, if you want Y, how you get to Y. There's got to be strategy sessions and people who do have a good understanding of the Iranian people, the Iranian regime, the Iranian geography, the military capacity, what we can do militarily. Those people didn't all leave government, did they?
Well, Katie, look, you're bringing up the right question here. Was there real planning? Were the experts listened to? How did that feed into his strategy? Look, ultimately, the White House decides what kind of policy it wants to pursue, but it does need to go inside the government to find out whether or not that policy will work. And of course, what the Iranian response will be. What will they do on the Strait of Hormuz? What will they do to activate their terrorist networks? What will they do with ballistic missile launches? And to get that information, to have a legitimate policy that they can then use and advance and the such. And so, first of all, a lot of people were fired last year. I got to say it, especially in the energy space because of DOGE. State Department leaders in the Energy Bureau gone. So we don't have that expertise on the inside. The military questions, I'm certain that the Pentagon has all of that. Then the question is, did Pete Hegseth listen to it? Did the president listen to it? Or to what Tom said, did they expect this just to be a quick Venezuela operation, the sugar high of which I think we've now come down from? So you got to listen to the experts. A lot of them were fired. And then we know there will be an Iranian response. So are we preparing properly for that? And I just think now we're seeing that the limits of this administration's planning are becoming very evident related to this war.
Well, Tom, let's keep on that note. The people that would have an idea of the contingencies and the knock-on effect, if you do X, you're going to get Y, et cetera. Were they all fired? Or is there nobody left in this administration? Or did Donald Trump, as far as we can tell, just dismiss them all? Or were those sorts of plans, those contingencies, never even brought to him because it's not the sort of thing he wants to hear?
Well, that's part of the problem. And when you ask, were they all fired? It kind of doesn't matter. The question is, would any of them be in the room? The way you posed the question to Joel a moment ago is take us inside a typical briefing room. There is no such thing as a typical briefing in this administration. We are dealing with, and it's painful to say it, with an emotionally unstable and cognitively impaired president whose briefings amount to showing him B-rolls of bombs, of things blowing up for 2 minutes every morning. That is not the way to brief the commander in chief. That's a way to keep him entertained while everybody tries to figure out what's going on. The other problem here is that even if people weren't fired, they've been moved out or silenced or, sent elsewhere. We basically don't have, the United States does not have a functioning National Security Council right now. In theory, Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, but that's just putting titles on desks. There isn't a National Security Council. The Pentagon is in the hands of a completely unqualified person in way over his head. The State Department can't function with a part-time secretary. The whole business, is kind of this rattle trap of people improvising because, as we said at the start, this is basically whatever the president, whatever stray neuron happens to be firing or whatever passes in front of his eyes. This isn't a plan. This is improvisation at every level of the national security bureaucracy.
So, Peter, inside the White House, what is the conversation right now? Is it just about, I say this slightly, strategic aims in Iran or how far they can get? Are they talking about politics? Are they concerned about where Americans are on this idea of never being involved in a forever war and maybe getting into another one? We've seen The president's approval numbers are not good. The economic numbers are not good. They already had a razor-thin majority in the House, almost impossible to hang on to even in good times, and these are not good times. There's talk about the Senate. What is the conversation being had at the White House, if not with Donald Trump, then one rung below Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly aware of the political risks at this point. No question about it. You're right. They were already likely to lose the House under normal circumstances, and they worried about the Senate already. And now what's happening, of course, puts that even more further in the distance for them. But what they keep telling themselves, at least what the president keeps telling himself, is that when he makes this end, which could be tomorrow, it could be 2 weeks from now, it could be a month from now, who knows, that everything will somehow snap back. Gas prices will go down. Inflation will be under control. The markets will stabilize and begin to go back up again. And somehow magically everybody will forget that this happened, or give him credit for the fact that he somehow achieved some aim of which he is not exactly explaining what that might be. And it's the people around him who know better are, of course, reluctant to confront him with information he doesn't like. He's made very clear he doesn't like contrary information. For time after time, when he has bad poll numbers, people around him tend to show him the one question in a poll that might be useful to him, or the one thing that seems helpful to them in making some case. They often showed him, for instance, what the approval number is among Republicans, ignoring the fact that his approval among everybody else, is in the toilet. And so I think that he gets sort of limited information. And people are very wary that if they tell him things he doesn't like to hear, that puts them in a hot seat.